Namaste, Sraddhalu, and
Namaste.
namaste all, and welcome to Evenings with Sraddhalu. Today he will be covering the power of Siddhis with extensive quotes, I believe, from the record of yoga.
Yes. Siddhis of power, which
Siddhi,
is the
Siddhis of
yes,
power, sorry.
yes.
Yes.
It's the theme that we have been going in some depth for the last couple of weeks. I did not think we would go into this kind of depth, and so I had actually planned originally that we would cover all of them in a single day, but it's turned out to be much more useful to go into this kind of detail because Sri Aurobindo himself takes us to that level of detail in the way he describes the siddhis, their working, the conditions for their full working, and for their safe utilization, etc. So I think it's worth doing a deep dive in this manner. Hopefully, today we will complete the overall theme of the three power siddhis. Last time we had covered the first of them, and that was the siddhi of Aishwarya. You will remember before this, there was the two siddhis of knowledge, prakamya and vyapti. Last time we saw how Aishwarya is the effectiveness of the will acting on an object or event without the aid of any physical means. And there are four degrees of its operation. The first one is when the pressure of the consciousness or the heat of intense focus of consciousness goes straight on the object and modifies that, works it out. The second is where the pressure is not on the object, but on its nature. The third is when the pressure is to change circumstances which indirectly compel that particular outcome. And the fourth is without any special pressure, by mere thought, which is a will, by the command of which the Divine Lord gives, of which the Prakriti spontaneously and automatically nature obeys. So these are four degrees, but you notice also in this four sequence, it's very interesting to observe how we are compelled by, I will generally use the word time, to grow, to change. Normally, as we grow, life unfolds, we make an effort to change. That's the action of the first grade. When we try, we cannot, we give up, or we just ignore, we don't even try. Eventually, our nature compels because the fallback is what you're used to being, what you call yourself as my habits, my preference, my comforts, my likes and dislikes. That's your nature. That makes you do it in any case. And the bulk of humanity lives on this level of operation. We do not because we want to do, but because that's our nature and we let the nature flow. But the third stage is where, let's say, your nature fails. I'm unable to make this effort.
Right.
Uh-huh. Do you see me now? Okay. I'm not able to see the video here. Maybe I can do a refresh, hopefully. Okay. My apologies for the delay. There was a power failure and the Wi-Fi was not on the UPS. So unfortunate. I don't know exactly where it got cut off, but I was describing the 4 grades at which we tend to live or events tend to happen. First is where you are making an effort because you want to. And the scope of that is very narrow normally for most people. And very few people actually bother to make that. The second is where your nature is compelling you. And most people tend to live on that, or to put in other words, most of our day and most of our life is lived by our habitual nature compelling, pushing, carrying us. Think about it. How often do you make an effort to overcome your habitual nature to do something which is contrary to your nature, to your likes, to your resistance of dislikes, to your temperaments, comfort, etc. So that's really the point of pressure where, let's say, a larger Aishwaram of in the universe is nudging and pushing you. If you're receptive, occasionally that leaks through and pops out as your will that says, hey, I think I need to make an effort, and you make that extra bit. So that's first. And then the second is your nature. The third is crashing circumstances or circumstances compelling you somehow to do. And I was giving an example of a person who was living in Pondicherry and he had isolated himself. He would live alone. And there were times when people went to his door and knocked and he would just ignore. He had his minimum food routine, which he would buy in bulk, and then he would just eat that. It was all stocked, stored food. And then one day, after 2 weeks or 3 weeks, he ran out of his food and he comes out to go and buy the food. And he discovers that his 500 rupee note is no more valid. It was at that time when the demonetization had happened. And suddenly he had no money. He couldn't buy his food. And that's the first time he was forced by crashing circumstances, so to say, compelling circumstances externally, to reach out to one of his family friends and said, hey, can you please loan me money because I don't have any money to eat food. So it's interesting how there's a compulsion of circumstances, nature, universe, behind that divine will unfolding in time. At the cutting edge on the front is when you are open to that and in some way indirectly broken, fragmented reflection of the divine will working through you, even in distorted forms, is your effort. Most people don't even do that. Second level is where nature, your nature, to which you fall back on, you lean against, that makes you do. It's uncomfortable, so I do. It's comfortable, so I do, etc. And then behind that, if you still don't, and you really hang on in inertia long enough, circumstances kick you painfully into action. And if still you resist, then you tend basically to break down and become irrelevant or paid out of existence. So you notice that these are 3 pressures on which some kind of a, let's say, universal Aishwaryam, if we may use such a term, or the working of the divine will compels anyway indirectly. And in this operation of Aishwaryam, where you or a person, let's take the example of Sri Aurobindo, is exercising a higher will. If the person is totally in inertia and resistant, it will be through the third process where circumstances indirectly compel the outcome. And this is so powerful, effectively nothing can resist eventually. But it's slow, it takes time because circumstances have to change. Of course, the fourth method will be where just the mere pressure or thought and nature obeys, but it's still happening through nature, but not just circumstances. That nature would include your nature and even your will. But if you're more receptive, then there's an action on your will, on your nature, personal nature, and something shifts and changes. You say, you know what? Now I find it much more enjoyable to do this or eat that or meet those people, etc. Your nature has changed. Or if you're open, actively present in your personal effort in a sadhana of a kind where you make an effort to change and grow, then you realize it's necessary, you make an effort, etc. And Sri Aurobindo's will at that point can act through that effort that you make to give a result far greater than you could have. If that fails or flags, it'll act through your nature or it will act through circumstances. So observe how this framework actually suggests a much larger working, which I'm using my own phrase of a universal or divine will working through a kind of an Aishwaryam. This understanding will be useful because later we will see what that larger Aishwaryam is. It's a very important insight. So this we saw last time, the four types or ways by which the Aishwaryam works. And we come now to the next of the Siddhi of power, which is Ishita. Ishita and the word Aishwarya in Sanskrit, they suggest already. Aishwarya is derived from Ishvara. Ishvara is the Lord. But again, the word Lord is not a good translation. Ishvara comes from Ish, which from the root suggests the one who possesses, the master who possesses. Isha from Isha Upanishad, the one who possesses, and the object of possession is enjoyment, Sri Aurobindo says. So the Lord who possesses the whole universe, that is Isha or Ishvara. Ishvara and Aishwaryam is of the nature of the lordship of the divine consciousness. So that's why he says the highest form of Aishwarya is when it is the will of God working through the chit and the tapas of God and automatically working through the prakriti who obeys automatically. So this was to conclude the discussion of last time. We now come to the next power of the Siddhi of power is Ishita, which again comes, you see the same Isha, Ishita. And it's the same root for Ichha, desire, intent. And so from that understanding, you will appreciate the meaning of Ishita. Ishita is the same effectiveness of the will, acting not as a command or through the thought by ajnanam, but through the heart or temperament, chitta, in a perception of need or pure lipsa. So it's exactly the same operation, but there is no command going out. It's not going through thought. It's not going as an authoritative command. It comes through the heart or temperament, and then he uses the word chitta. Chitta is also the underlying substance of consciousness. In a perception of need or pure lipsa. Now, the word lipsa is, if you look at the translations recommended, wish, desire, more accurately, it translates in the yoga terms as a pure need or aspiration. Something within you just turns in a need or aspiration, not articulated necessarily, not pushing, and not willing out. So there's a perception, oh, this is needed, and you turn towards it. So this is felt more in the heart or in the consciousness, which is not pushing at all. And there's no mind will implied. Just that turning of the consciousness and the same effectiveness of will is achieved. So whatever the lipsa reaches out towards, or even needs without conscious knowledge of the need, comes of itself to the man who possesses Ishita. So there are two forms. The need, the lipsa, reaches out. Oh, this. You don't have to put a will. It's required. Or needs without conscious knowledge of the need. You don't even know that in your kitchen you've run out of food and or you run out of milk, and then somehow it just comes. It happens. So comes of itself to the man who possesses Ishita. This phenomenon, when it occurs, we will say of that person that they are lucky. Luck is the word we use to describe when this phenomenon happens spontaneously or frequently. So then we go into nuances. Ishita also expresses itself either by pressure on the object or Prakriti, or by simple perception automatically effective of its aim. So when this operates, even if you have not put a pressure, the power itself is doing its thing either directly on the object or on the nature of the object or on the general nature, or simply there's a perception and it happens spontaneously for what it's required. Sri Aurobindo personally, having already mastered these to an exalted, extraordinary degree, naturally, spontaneously expressed the working of these powers. And one of the consequences of this was, which many people who were around him noticed and observed, and it's recorded by many, that he never asked somebody to do something. He never said, for example, can you bring me water? Can you bring me tea? Can you do this? Can you bring food? Never. It's almost as if, to their view, he was calm, equal. It didn't matter to him. It was brought, it was not brought. But he never said, please do this. Now, in fact, from this perspective, you will understand why. Because when he needed it, it got done. And we're going to read eventually examples of many such things. But the fact that the power of Aishwaryam, Ishitam, and even Vashita were operational naturally within him, and to an extraordinary degree of their highest operation, meant that he did not need to even give that command. So occasionally, if something was required, particular thing, he would look in that direction, and Champaklal or others would immediately catch what he was suggesting or needing and to do the thing itself. So that's about the maximum people have noticed that he would express. And so the last is again the highest power of Ishita and its supreme Siddhi. This last is simple perception automatically effective of its aim. And this is what generally around Sri Aurobindo, he lived in that. The mother, on the other hand, had to more directly engage with execution of activity for the ashram administration. There she had to tell people. And in most cases, when the person was a sadhaka who was very open and receptive, the guidance she gave was minimal, just enough to help orient the person's thoughts, emotions in a specific direction. And the rest she did by the force that she infused within the person, and the person's openness ensured that it worked out. In temperaments which were more rebellious or more resistant, there was necessity for giving specific types of guidance. Otherwise, for example, she would assign a project to a person who was a good instrument, and sometimes she would have a very clear plan, and the plan itself would unroll in that person's consciousness. He would come back saying, oh, see, I've done so much. And then she would say, oh, yes, it's wonderful. And if necessary, some minor corrections, if at all. In most cases, that was not needed for such people, at least. But they had the impression that they created it, not knowing that it was her consciousness working in them that was creating it. But she was conscious of that. Occasionally, she would tell people that she has given them a force, etc. There are phrases she has used which are in this direction. When she was working with Sunilda regarding the playing of the organ music, where she was trying to bring down new music. And she said to him, I will play through your hands. Now, the person being naturally more receptive, conscious, and open to her, before playing would concentrate, consciously align himself and his hands to her, and then let the movement begin. If the person was not such, then the effect would be different, or the degree of that infusion would be different. The same thing happened with Huta. She said, I will paint through your hands. And so there was a whole sadhana that Huta was led through by the mother, who taught her everything from basic cleaning of brushes to different kinds of strokes and use of different kinds of materials, but all the while infusing in her physical consciousness, including, and of course, other layers, her consciousness, to the point where it was literally as if when Huta would paint, it would be an expression of mother's consciousness materialized. To that extent, the transparency she sought to develop. In practice, it also took an unusual form that at some point when Huta had to select lines from Savitri for mother to read out, and those she was recording, which later are used in Sunil Das' music, it was all Huta's work. She found that mother was struggling to read, so she would write in large handwriting. And even then, mother was struggling. So what she did was she wrote in a handwriting which is similar to mother's. And then mother was absolutely fine and she read very clearly. Now, the consequence of that was for the rest of her life, whenever she wrote, her handwriting resembled the mother's. So it's not just that, well, she imitated the form, but that infusion of the mother's consciousness to that degree actually meant that that was the natural way in which things flowed from her. So there's quite a remarkable achievement in that way. How much of that would be the operation of Ishita, I don't know. I'm just giving you this as a background to show how, in the normal working of the mother's action through people, there were elements of these powers of Aishwaryam, Ishita, and Vashita operating naturally, constantly. So, in her case, I've given one example already earlier. When things were needed, people would spontaneously feel the need for it and bring to her, give to her, and things like that. Occasionally, she would say, and just that one saying was not like, "Hey, can you do this?" When she said it, it was a trigger for a whole movement that would emerge. I'll give an example of that. Jumanbai narrated to us. He was in charge of the farms of the ashram. And he narrated to us how at some point he was bringing the vegetables and fruits which were grown in the ashram's farms. And at some point when he had given her something, I don't remember what it was, juice from one of the fruits, the mother tasted and then she said, "Can you not bring me uh, the fruits or vegetables without the content of the poison?" By which she meant the uh, things which were being sprayed to kill pests, and which she could feel, she could taste in the food itself and the effect that it had on the body. So at that point, Dyuman Bhai goes back and starts a whole new movement of organic production in what was then Gloria Farms. That single statement triggered a whole movement of innovative development possibilities, etc., for the next few decades. So there were things like this where a single yes sometimes would become the forerunner of a whole unfolding of chain of events. So there was a form externally of what might be called a command, thought, will, but what followed through was seen as not being done by a specific command. It was just the natural consequence of an intention, will, or a need. So we've touched upon Aishwaryam and Ishita. The difference being that in the Ishita, there is no sense of will or command put out through the mind, but simply from the heart, a need, a perception, and that's all. You will notice also in the response, people who are temperamentally more aligned in heart and open in heart, this particular action is natural, Ishita particularly, is natural to them. Whereas those who are much more open in the mind and need or feel the difference, for them the action of the Aishwarya would be more natural. But you can see how there's a continuum. We come now to the third Siddhi of power, Vashita. And the root for that in Sanskrit, vash, has to do with ownership, control, etc. So Vashita, Sri Aurobindo defines in this way. Vashita is the control of the object in its nature so that it is submissive to the spoken word, receptive of the thought conveyed, or sensitive and effective of the action suggested. We'll look at each of these. Let's read the full text first. Vashita acts automatically through established control of one nature by another, or by the pouring of natural force into the word, thought, or suggestion of action so as to produce an effect on the nature of others. The latter, this pouring of force into the word, thought, or suggestion, the latter is the lower and ordinary siddhi. The former, when it acts automatically through established control of one nature by another. The former, the supreme or entirely divine siddhi. And then he makes a very interesting observation. Vyapti is one of the chief agents of Vashita. Now you will recall the discussion on Vyapti. Vyapti is that state in which the consciousness of another actually comes upon you, into you. You feel it as if taking place within you by sort of an underlying identity or a reflection within you of their consciousness. You are not reaching out as in prakamya. So Vyapti is the way one of the chief agents of Vashita. So here you get a clue of how the earlier power of knowledge becomes now the basis for a faculty of or action of power. In this, it's as if your consciousness blending, meeting, joining with another's consciousness becomes the basis for this control. So let's look at the thing in detail. Vashita is the control of the object in its nature. So you are acting in its nature, not directly operating on the functioning of the object. You're modifying it at a level where its habitual tendency itself is being affected. So it does not experience any resistance because it lives by its nature. The nature itself is being influenced and it does it. So that it is submissive. Submissive to the spoken word, receptive of the thought conveyed, or the third word he's using, sensitive and effective of the action suggested. Submissive, receptive, sensitive, and effective. Now, if you notice these three terms, they again represent degrees. The first one being totally dominated, submissive. You give a verbal command and the person is submissive, as in, and we'll take a very common form of this lower and ordinary siddhi, which is, let's say, the phenomenon of hypnosis. But we'll see other forms where it's not so obviously hypnosis, but it is of the same grade. So the hypnotist says, do this, and this happens, or you do it. The second, which is less complete in the control, is receptive of the thought, but it is also more subtle. So you have not said, do this, but you have intended it, and the person does it. The third one, which is even more refined and of a finer grade, less coarse, is sensitive and effective of the action suggested. So there's a suggestion, and already you're sensitive and effective, and it comes through. Now, if you see the sequence, it may seem as if the submission of the spoken word is more powerful because obviously it is more superficially strong, superficially visible. But in fact, as you go through the second and third, that is more powerful because it is a suggestion of a finer kind, and the person may not even know, or you may not know that this is working in you. So receptive to thought conveyed, you wouldn't even know that the thought has been conveyed to you. You're receptive to it, and you're executing it. Or you're sensitive and effective of the action suggested. There's a suggestion given. And the suggestion is not even fully articulated, even in thought. And you're sensitive to it and you start already shaping in that direction. So if you think about it from more crude, visible, dramatically seen to something more refined, but almost hidden and concealed. And you don't even know that it's being done or it's happening. So Vashita acts automatically through established control of one nature by another. In all three cases, it is one nature which is controlling another nature. Or, not as automatic, by the pouring of natural force into the word, thought, or suggestion of action in the nature of the other. So it's either nature automatically working on another nature, or there's a pouring of force into that nature into the word, thought, or suggestion of action, so as to produce an effect on the nature of others. Now, in the second case, where you have this pouring of force, the force enters, modifies nature, compels it, makes things happen by any of these three ways: word, thought, or suggestion of action. But there's a pouring of force entering. If at some point the pouring of the force itself stops, or the person senses the force and puts a counter force of resistance, then you can see how it can get complicated. But in the higher, so this is what he calls the lower and ordinary Siddhi. But the former and supreme or entirely divine Siddhi is when there is an automatic action through established control of one nature by another. And the nature has established a control, it's happening. That's it. So we'll take a few examples. I'm going to take examples which are more accessible first and more commonly seen in public life, and then we can see how that may act in a spiritual context also. You are all working in your office, and maybe the mood has changed. People are fooling around. There's a bit of a dispersal of attention, concentration. The work has slowed down or has been forgotten, and there's a bit of a chaos perhaps. Suddenly, the boss walks in. What happens? First, you sense it. You sense a shift in the environment. You look. If you see that, oh, boss has come, straight away you go to your focus. What happened there was, it's more obvious. There's an indication the boss has come. He's not pleased. You do what has to be done. Or, more refined, the boss has not yet come, but is now thinking of coming. There's an impression put out. And that impression suddenly hits you. And in your mind, the thought comes, oh, boss might come now. Or, oh, I'm too distracted. I need to get back to my work. And that command, as if works on you, shapes your behavior. Or variant, push it in the other direction, more crude, gross. A word, a message is given and sent. A phone call, an intercom, something through the public address system. Or someone says, he's coming, the word. Or the boss enters and says, what's happening? The word triggers. Now, if you notice of these three, the most refined is when nothing has been said overtly. Just the thought or even the suggestion that comes, oh, I think I need to. There's actually an experience I want to share, and some of these experiences I will share more freely because the person has passed on and I might have been more careful about sharing the names. This was narrated to me by D.V. Joshi, Dhirubhai Joshi, I think, who was the head of the ashram's school's laboratory. And he's the person I've mentioned before who one day woke up at the age of 21 and he realized that to be happy is a choice and it does not depend on external conditions. And he decided from that moment on, he will only be happy. And he says since then he's never been unhappy, despite whatever may happen externally. But he shared this example. He said that at some point he was working closely with Pavitrada, who was at that point the head of the school. And working closely with him, they were monitoring the overall trends of classes going on, etc. And he said the monitoring was done on two levels. Of course, they would go physically, but they were also sensing things. And it was under mother's guidance. So, and these people were unusual people, so they had naturally this opening. And then one day he said, he sensed that something was wrong in a particular class. So this is not actually Vashita, but it's more in the form of the first Vyapti. But you see, it's connected with Vashita because that's the mechanism for Vashita. He senses, and then he goes and talks to the students. What are you doing in the class? Investigates casually. And it turns out he discovers that that particular teacher was sitting in the class and saying, the first rule of first principle of true teaching is that nothing can be taught. So I'm not going to teach you. We'll all sit down and meditate and we'll all learn automatically. And that's how the class had been proceeding. They dismissed the teacher naturally. But this was an extension of consciousness in which they felt something was not okay. Now, from this Vyapti faculty, you would have felt something not okay, and depending on the circumstances, you would infuse a corrective movement. You feel this particular group, this particular room, this particular team is in a bit of a chaos. They're dispersed or they've lost focus, and you infuse something to correct it. And that would be the operation of this working of Ashita on that level, of the most refined level. But you see how Vyapti becomes the agency for this. But in fact, they did that also in many cases. So when you have this, let's say a little bit of this faculty operating, the person would have come to the classroom, maybe greeted the teacher, looked within, and if there was a slight correction required, that would have been enough to correct it. So a good administrator with this power will rarely be seen to be giving an order, but he will be meeting and interacting constantly with people so as to extend that influence and make corrections through that. There's a particular person who is known for this, Dr. Venkatraman, I think, Dr. V, who is the head of the Aravind Eye Hospital, and of which, for the system of governance, administration, and management that they had instituted, I believe there was a Harvard study which extolled it as something exceptional. So one of the things they saw was he was handling a huge, complex operation. There's a pun there. He was doing eye surgery. So he was doing surgeries, literally hundreds, sometimes thousands of people. And there was a complex operation ongoing, managed, but there was hardly any hierarchy. It was highly decentralized. It's almost as if he had direct contact with each person, but he was not seen to be creating governance structures which are typically required for such institutional work. And he was asked about it. What do you do to maintain the standards? Because one of the key elements there they found was everybody working there was very highly motivated, very highly dedicated, committed to the work in a way that is well beyond anything you might, even if you paid them a lot of money. So what made for this culture? And they asked him, what is it that you do? He said, there's only one thing which I insist upon. He said, I eat with them. He would sit lunchtime or whenever it was, he would sit with them and be interacting while they were eating. That was his way of transmitting certain values and certain qualities which held the group motivated, organized, and created this very non-hierarchical but very efficient and effective organization. And again, there's this power of Vyapti. The problem with the management studies is they do not take into account this factor. They reduce it to just that. Oh, he was sitting and talking while having lunch, so he was transmitting values through the chattering that takes place during lunch, except you hardly saw that kind of chattering. It was the contact of consciousness, and through Vyapti, the infusion, etc. But that contact was needed to sustain the, let's say, quality of consciousness and values that were being built. So in the Vyapti, you see this factor of some degree of contact, which may need to be infused or activated by frequent contact. And from you'll see where I'm getting to from here. Now that contact is non-physical. It's purely psychological. And maybe he shares stories, maybe he talks a little bit. But in that, the way he's transmitting, the way the values that he lives, people get that and are infused in it. You see, from here, if you went to a cruder form of the power of Vashita, then sometimes the person would need to have contact. Again, it could be energetic contact or physical contact. So I'll give an example here. There's a person who is referred to in the mother's agenda. The name is not given. It is C, just the letter C, and I will not speak of that. This person had lived in the ashram. He became very famous going outside the ashram. When he left, the mother made a comment, and this is recorded in the agenda, where she made a comment that there was a being that had attached to him. And she asked him, how long has it been with you? And it was clearly one of those things which gives you a hypnotic influence, of which we have spoken of before. And then she told him that never to use the name of Sri Aurobindo and the mother for whatever he was doing. So what was clear was she let him continue whatever line he had chosen, but ensured that it would not be misused. So he became very famous. He had a very large following, etc. And he took care, although people knew that he had grown up in the ashram, he took care not to mention their names directly. He was his own kind of teacher, etc. About him, mother comments that the being provides a hypnotic influence. And she says, it needs to be renewed every 3 days. If the person does not have contact with him for more than 3 days, that hypnotic link fades out. So he would need to make that contact psychologically, need not be physically, every 3 days to sustain that control and influence. And we will now use the word hypnotic influence on them. Extend this a further degree of crudeness, and it would modify to the point where you needed physical contact. Now, I'll give an example of this. There's a person that I know, and you see in business, many famous, effective leaders tend to have this power of Vashita on the cruder form generally, and they use it. Some are conscious that they have it, not knowing this name particularly, but they're conscious that they can influence people, do it consciously also. Others are conscious that they can do something, they don't know how they do it, but they do it anyway, because they can feel the effect. Often with such people, you'll find them extremely confident, because they know that if they interact long enough with somebody, they can convince them of anything and get a yes as an outcome. It's even more interesting to see when two people of this type meet and for different objectives, and they sense each other's power. And then it's a fascinating game of how they tend to dominate each other or come to a compromise. But they recognize they both have this power and make some kind of adjustment against others to maintain that control that they have over others. So I give an example of a person who has this power, who uses it frequently, both in business as well as in personal life. And he has this tendency of swaying people, to get them overwhelmed, to get their thinking itself modified after some interaction. So I had watched carefully. There were certain things which were very clearly technical. So I'm going to now come back to the text. Spoken word, receptive of thought, and sensitive and effective of the action suggested. So these are 3 levels on which the influence, or through which the influence is put out. And in the lower working, he explains, pouring of natural force into the word, thought, or suggestion, so as to produce an effect on the nature of others. So you interacted with this person and he would say things, suggest things, etc. You came away convinced that this was your idea and that you had to do this. Or if nothing else, you felt overwhelmed by this and were willing to do whatever he had said, as if it was the most natural thing for you to do. Once that energy wore off, you would start questioning, well, why am I doing this? Why am I going out of my way? And if you were a kind, good, loyal, moralistic person, you'd say, yes, but I've told him I will do. Let me finish. But still, that questioning points out to something which is not okay. So there was a point when I was sitting with this person, and he was trying to convince me of something which I outright said it doesn't work, it doesn't feel right. And then as he was speaking, suddenly he leaned forward. And as he leans, I can feel this whole turn of his energy pouring out. And his aura is literally embracing me and pouring energy into me. I'm conscious of it. So it's okay, but somebody I'm not against, or I'm comfortable, so it's all right. But I'm aware of it. Then after a while, he leans forward a little more, and then with his hand, with his fingers like this, he, as if pumping energy, pushes his hand on my knee, on my leg, on the knee, and says, "But you must do this. It is absolutely necessary." And as he pumps it, as he touches, I feel that energy flowing into me. And because I'm too sensitive to these things normally, I immediately had a reaction. And I pulled away my knee and I said, "What are you doing? You're pumping energy into me." And that was the thing which broke his focus. And he suddenly stepped back and said, "You can feel it." He was surprised. So he was conscious that he was pumping this energy, we'll use words now for it, fluid, magnetic fluid, as they used to call it 100 years ago in Europe. He was pumping this energy, and it was his way of compelling, convincing, drawing people into his orbit of thought, feeling, emotion, action, and getting things done. What I found over time was the group that forms around him as a consequence because of his work, business, and other consisted of people who were more receptive to this. Those who had resistance automatically got weeded out. So the whole team which formed in the business or in the work or even personal life were people who were amenable to this kind of molding. You see, so I'm giving this as an example. Inevitably, in such cases, they may not be able to carry with them the best of people because of this reliance on the inferior operation of the Siddhi. On the other hand, and I'm going to compare this sharply with Elon Musk, in whom the same power exists, but not operating on this coarser level. It is operating on a much larger, freer, higher level. May not be in the highest, as Sri Aurobindo describes here, nevertheless on a higher level, where it taps into the higher ideal and for the suggested action. So he holds this great ideal, whatever it may be. Let's take SpaceX to establish a colony on Mars. That is what he's using to compel, unite, and form the teamwork of SpaceX, for example. Underlying that, there may be other things. There'll be a pouring of natural force into word, thought, suggestion of action, etc. But there's a higher goal and purpose. So this allows somebody of a higher grade to fit into the team structure and receive this. It's not so personal. It's not so narrow. And so the scope and variety of people that he can hold and carry in his team is much larger. He can hold gradations of competence of far greater order, because a higher grade competence will generally not submit to a lower grade of influence. Nevertheless, both are effective in what they want to get done within their scope. And then you have everything, ranges further beyond, below, etc. But I'm giving these examples because these would be accessible and tangible also to understand how the thing works. I'm again going to focus on a few words when Sri Aurobindo uses this phrase, the pouring of natural force into the word, thought, or suggestion of action so as to produce an effect on the nature of others. This force has been poured on the word. The word has been conveyed and touches you, and as it enters you, that natural force produces an effect on the nature of others. You put energy into the word, energy into the thought, energy into the suggestion of action. There's the pouring of natural force. Now, the tendency for people when they read a text like this is to say, it's a poetic narration. No, it's not. It's a literal description of this energy being pumped and poured. So I gave this example of the person who was pumping energy. I could feel that. or when he was leaning forward and doing this. But I've seen this with so many leader types. Some of them do it in a more crude and brutal way. They'll come into the office and shout an order. What is this? Breaks, shakes, and everyone is running, scurrying around. They go away, the energy is still there. It's a more chaotic energy. It's not affectionate, it's not embracing. It gets things done, but on a coarser level, and it does not build a good teamwork. It does not build a long-term harmony. It's good for a team which is more mechanically structured, but not united in an ideal. So that also is another type. But the force they have put into the word is what stays. The word has passed, the person has gone, the force stays. And the ability to put that force. I've seen this in a different context. Again, a different type of businessman who never shouts. Tremendous vitality. And you can see when he goes into the mode when he wants to get something done, there's a tightening, energizing, and he'll take a decision. And when he says, this, no, nothing else, not that. You can see in the team the effect when he says not that, it's as if it erases that thing. Now, this is a very interesting power I've noticed. And all of these you will see in the phenomenon of hypnosis when we discuss that. It's not only that it projects a certain direction, but it also removes and erases something else. I remember this was in a context, again, of a person I have known who has actually a spiritual background, but he exercises this Vashita power very powerfully with people around him. And I had met with somebody from a different tradition, and then he came to me and simply said, this person came to the other person who's from, let's say, from a space that I am familiar with. He said to me, you don't need to do that anymore. And as if he made a gesture of wiping. What I noticed was from that point on, my contact with that person was completely stopped for years. And each time in my consciousness when I turned, but I want to reach out, it was as if this power which had wiped away something that was there. I couldn't reach out. Sometimes I felt guilty, but every time the mind turned to do this, it had been wiped out as if, and I couldn't get a grip on it. So the way the power works, effect on the nature of others, can be both in forming a positive turn as well as erasing something. If correctly used, in my view, that was not correctly used the way he had done it on me. But if correctly used, it can also be used to erase a traumatic memory, amplify a positive memory, etc. But always there is this pouring of natural force into the word transmits, the force stays, even after the word has passed. Or into the thought. So in this case, when this person made this erasing movement, in the thought, I literally looking back, it's as if he erased a formation. He erased something, and I couldn't find it anymore. It was not there inside me. Or suggestion of action. So that can be on an even more subtle level. Again, the same person I've seen using this power. I'm going to give a more personal example. So somebody had come to me to discuss a certain project and wanted me to participate in that. It had something to do with education. He had worked out in great detail. We discussed a little bit something. He went and met that person that I was referring to. That person threw him a suggestion not to do it or not to do it with me. From that moment on, 30 years passed, this person never came back. And it was so amazing just to see the effect of how powerfully person's behavior can be molded just like that overnight or in a few seconds. And the impacts lasted so long. So I recognize this power. I consider it a misuse. Nevertheless, the person probably doesn't. Maybe believes it was for good, whatever it was. But when you see things like this happening, you notice how the power works. You realize how much of human relationships, influences, organizational structures are dependent on the effectivity of this. So now we'll come to more specific coarser examples, and then we'll go to the more spiritual temperament. So the coarser example, we're still staying with this pouring of natural force, thought, word, suggestion of action. And we turn to something which is in the domain that is popularly known as hypnosis. It's exactly the same phenomenon. It is a working of the Vashita power, but on a coarser, cruder level. But again, there are variations among hypnotists. But let's look at this physical operation first. When first hypnosis was being largely used in Europe for purpose of healing, they used to refer to it as human magnetism. So you had magnets, you saw magnets attract, repel, and it's as if you took that phenomenon of attraction, repulsion, because it's invisible force, onto a psychological level, and they would refer to it as magnetic fluid. There's a very famous operator of this fluid, let's say, whose name was Anton Mesmer. From his name comes the verb mesmerism, or noun mesmerism, or to mesmerize as verb. And he had this extraordinary ability of, in their vocabulary, magnetic fluid, with which he could heal people, erase traumas, form new habits, or taken to a more dramatic form, get people to behave in strange ways by the suggestion, by the power of suggestion. So I'm describing this in its purest form in what is called mesmerism, and hypnosis is a more specialized form of it. So in the operation of this mesmerism and the mesmeristic power, even the suggestion given and the person would find suddenly, oh, this illness is gone, the pain is gone, you are healed, or things like that. The idea of the human magnetism was that at that time they were experimenting with the effect of magnets on water, on tissue for healing, etc. North side is supposed to be calming and anti-inflammatory. South side is supposed to be exciting and inflammatory, etc. So there was a whole theory built along it, and I believe there's a deep truth to it. There was a time when we had also experimented with that in the ashram. Many people were playing with it. Didn't last long, but during the time, people said they had effect. But so that was a coarser form, material form, magnetism, physical magnets is still very crude. Behind that is this life energy magnetism or human magnetism or mesmerism and the fluid that flows with it. And there are people who are endowed with this. I have seen examples of people who have a tremendous physical grade of energy. You feel gradation. There's mental energy, there's a vital energy, emotional energy, and there's something which approaches almost a physical grade. I don't see auras in this way, but people who do see would describe it normally as a very thick layer of the blue. The subtle physical, which is normally like a centimeter or two at most in most people, tends to be really large. Or after doing certain practices, it suddenly swells up really big and much more than other people. And it's dense, dark, bright blue, but very dense. And that often is associated with this grade of influence when that is redirected. So a lot of it comes to a certain energy which is almost material, which is then directed. And this is what makes for the very dramatic kinds of both healing as well as influence. So the ability of these people who have a strong influence like this is to be then able to hypnotize a person. I will come to the phenomenon of hypnotism itself, and I'll speak of a spectrum there. You will find on the internet, particularly on YouTube videos, a lot of people demonstrating what is called instant induction, instant hypnosis. The person reaches out, shakes hand, suddenly pulls, and the person is in a deep state of hypnosis. Or they will reach out and pat the person and suddenly pull them, and they're in hypnosis. So at that point, often there is a word spoken, but behind that is the thought suggestion infused with this pouring of natural force. The more the person has that force, the more easy it is for them to pull or push somebody into a state of hypnosis or even retain them in it. Once they're in the state of hypnosis, the thought or suggestion of action is often enough. The word is hardly necessary. So as part of today's description, for the video, I have put two links. Both of them have to do with a stage hypnosis demonstration. For those who don't have much time, I have put one link which is of a 5 minutes demonstration, and there's another link which is of a 1 hour demonstration. For if you have the time, do watch the 1 hour demonstration, and then look for other such demonstrations. It is so remarkable how human beings can be molded and shaped in their behavior by this power of hypnosis. In this kind of stage demonstration, you do not see the first phase in which the more susceptible people from the audience are selected. Not everyone is as susceptible. So often the hypnotist will come to the stage performance and make a basic test. And he'll say, for example, bring your hand together, push these two fingers. Now you find you cannot separate them. And the more you try, the more you cannot separate, etc. Very simple verbal suggestion. Behind that, a certain intention of this push of the fluid energy. In the entire audience, something like 20% will have very dramatic effects, and typically 10 to 20% will have very weak effects. So he will pick from those who have very dramatic effects, and then often they have a sensitivity practice who's more receptive and open to the suggestion, and they'll pick those people and ask them to come on the stage. Now you'll see in the demonstration, there's one person who resists somehow. And you see how he deals with that person. Everybody else has been put into deep hypnosis. Just this one person is somehow resisting. And you'll see him hover around, come back to him, back and forth, suddenly come and say, oh, you're doing fine. And then suddenly move his head a little, relaxing his neck, and then say, sleep. Poof, the fellow goes to deep sleep. But it took him a while to kind of gather his energy. And if you observe carefully, you'll notice that he's infusing him and then the suggestion. So these videos can be very educative to understand the underlying process behind the phenomenon if you're a little bit sensitive to what's happening there. And once you have this background of the technology itself. Once in that state, you will see in the examples, the person can be told almost anything. In some cases, they'll be told, okay, now you are a chicken. And you behave like a chicken. And these people on the stage will start flapping their wings and making clucking noises. Or they can be told that somebody is coming now who's a very famous person and you're trying to impress them. And they live that reality. You can be told anything with eyes open, you're living that reality. The audience laughs. But for that person, it's as if the audience doesn't exist and they're living in that reality. I'm trying to show you something very important here. Take it a step further. It's not in these videos, but you'll find equivalent videos. This person is sent back to sit in the audience with a post-hypnotic suggestion. He's told, now you'll forget that you were hypnotized. But every time I speak the word hypnosis, you will get up and say, it is fake, and then sit down. So the fellow has gone back. He's sitting in the audience. He has no memory of this command given to him. And then the hypnotist speaks, and I think this is from one of the videos on the TED Talks on hypnosis. That one is titled Hypnosis Doesn't Work or something like that. Hypnosis is fake. So he plays on this idea. And each time the speaker says, and with hypnosis, this man gets up in the middle of the audience and shouts, hypnosis is fake, and then sits down. Now, if you think about the behavior itself, it's so weird. Anybody in the audience, if they were actually doing it consciously, would ask themselves, why am I doing this? They would feel odd about it. They'll feel ashamed. They'll feel strange. People will look at you and laugh and you'll feel odd. This man feels nothing. It's as if it's the most normal thing to do. As long as he's under that suggestion, post-hypnotic, the hypnosis has passed. The suggestion implanted is now working in him and has changed his nature. So remember, pouring of natural force into the word, thought, or suggestion of action so as to produce an effect on the nature of others. Your nature is changed. You see what a powerful tool it is. You're behaving in ways which are completely abnormal to your normal nature. But this is now your new normal. And then there's another example where, which I've seen on a video, where the person is told every time he hears a particular keyword, he has to get up and start drumming the head of somebody in front of him who's bald and start drumming it. Or in another case, start singing the national anthem whenever he hears a keyword. And the entire audience knows this, but the person is totally unaware that he has been implanted with the suggestion. He starts this weird behavior, antisocial even, not realizing that it is abnormal and unable to prevent it from happening. You can perhaps notice where I'm leading you to this, with this. There's a point where we recognize our nature programmed was not our choice. We did not program it. We don't even know what was programmed into us by others from outside. We are following our nature mechanically, and we are convinced this is normal for us because it's our nature's tendency. To a point where it can be ridiculous, and we would not be aware that it is ridiculous. And then you would describe this as a person under hypnotic suggestion or a post-hypnotic suggestion, where his will has been subverted by somebody else's will's suggestion. I'm going to take this to its logical conclusion. I'm going to say all of us are hypnotized with post-hypnotic suggestions of various kinds, which have been programmed into us that we are not even conscious of. In layers of our nature, some of these post-hypnotic suggestions you have inherited from your ancestors, parents, grandparents, others. Some of these you have got as an infection from outside by contact with somebody, and that formation has kind of jumped into you and has hooked into you somewhere. Some of these have been built up by statements, remember post-hypnotic suggestion, when you were in a semi-hypnotic state as a child, from comments people made to you, sometimes parents or some abusive observations, comments, criticisms, which you have internalized as yours and made yours as a knot or a distortion as a post-hypnotic suggestion, which is now shaping your behavior for the rest of your life. I still, for example, have a formation which came from my school days when for a few years I had teachers who were repeatedly, multiple times in a week, maybe in a single class, making comments like, oh, you have a dirty handwriting. And there's much later a teacher who made a comment, you know what, your handwriting is not bad. It's just your thoughts are going faster than your fingers, so your fingers are trying to catch up. And when she said that, I said, wow, that is such a deep insight. And for the first time, I as if undid my self-image and shame and sense of failure and helplessness towards this, and the word dirty handwriting, which was not correct. It's not the right word. But that suggestion had been implanted and so deep that there's still a knot of that somewhere inside. I've not bothered to deal with it. Doesn't matter perhaps, but I'm aware that it's there. And it acts subliminally, subconsciously, like a post-hypnotic suggestion when I'm writing, to as if confirm that tendency of a tendency to scroll rapidly when I write. And we are full of such things. We're not even conscious where they came from. This is an example. I'm conscious because of the memory of repeated comments. Otherwise, there are things which have gone in, I may not even remember from where. And then there are things which have picked up from the environmental suggestions. And then there are things you've picked up from programming that comes through the media, the things you pick up from the society's expectation, programming, and tendency to want to conform to social values and thought processes and norms of behavior. And all is your surface outer nature, covering, preventing the truth of your psychic being's natural tendency, its true nature, its divine nature from flowing out freely, naturally. Of course, you can say there are layers which are too dark, too clouded, even for its light or its tendency to flow through, etc. Nevertheless, the formations which are put out from outside are often contrary, false, fake, perverse. And when this tries to come out, it has to flow through those tendencies, mix with them, tending to get lost in them. Or occasionally it manages to cut a passage, bypassing them or even dissolving some of those knots to create a particular link. Sometimes in a special activity that you've persistently done with a spiritual aspiration. And it's as if a passage of light forms from inside outward in that activity, in that state, when doing or in that space sometimes. You move out of that space, you move into a different activity, you're activating other parts of your nature, and there's a mix. So I'm coming to something very profound here. It's kind of going beyond the scope of what we are discussing. But to make you conscious that your nature is formed of so much aggregation gathered over time, which is not yours. Your true nature has to emerge from within, dissolve, and replace this more and more. But it's the reality we face that your little nature is influenced by the larger local nature, which is influenced by the larger nature, etc. And there's a blend of mixtures of all kinds from individuals, groups, etc., overlaying, mixing, etc., which makes for a pretty big mess. So Vashita is acting on many levels, in many different contexts, in many different ways. But there are people who have this power and can exercise it by this pouring of natural force into the word, thought, or suggestion of action so as to produce an effect on the nature of others. These people tend generally to become either leaders or successful in achieving their goals even without being formally leaders, because they're able to shape behavior of others around them to get the outcomes that they desire. And this latter is the lower and ordinary siddhi. In the phenomenon of hypnosis, you see how far it can be pushed, how much or how deep the programming can be. For those of you who have watched the first few episodes of our discussion on current affairs, we had discussed of how there's a very sophisticated technology developed under the heading called MK Ultra. It was developed originally by the Nazis and then transplanted to the United States in the 1950s and 60s, developed and refined and perfected, by which through series of suggestions and associations, one could put a person under hypnosis, manipulate, leave suggestions, even modify behavior. And then done through the media, particularly through television, it is massive in its impact. You're programming the masses in the millions with a single show, implanting suggestions. And you can shape society so fast. That's how they actually do it, consciously, at that level. So you see certain agendas made and certain themes of movies built around a certain message only. And the message is so subtle that you don't realize that's the message, but normalizing certain types of behavior and so on. And so there is a whole hypnosis technology being operated on the mass of humanity today, even more directly through, or more refined in influence through social media, where your tablet, your telephone becomes a fine-tuned, personalized hypnosis session to shape your behavior. Behind this is the pouring of natural force through word, thought, and suggestions to modify you. The example of stage hypnosis shows you how far it can be pushed, to the point where you will be made to behave like an animal, forgetting that you're a human. Of course, they will not do that through social media because then it will expose the power of the influence. But that's the way you're being made to behave like an animal, except not like a chicken or a duck, like an ape, or your baser instincts are brought out and made the stronger influence to suppress or subdue your higher aspirations or your spiritual and soul values. And this is done deliberately. The contrary effect is also possible, where you remove the hypnotic influence. You wake up the person who's half asleep. It was fascinating for me to see how when Mark Oburn wrote in his first book, he said, seeing the number of people who are living a life which is as if you're sleeping in a half hypnotized state, he called it the world of sleepers. And it's true. You stand outside on a street corner, watch the traffic passing by. Maybe hundreds of people will pass within a minute. Observe the state of consciousness of each person, and you will see what is meant by sleepers. They're living in a hypnotized state, in a bubble of their own constructed reality belief system, not conscious of the underlying reality of the divine presence or of their soul or any of the higher aspirations and inner things which are right now present, which are the prime drivers, the most important thing of your life. It's all forgotten and lost, covered up by this hypnosis. I have to make money. I have to survive. I have to do this. I have to bound in rhythms, especially of strong emotions and very superficial thoughts, which bind you and cover you. And they live in that hypnosis. And there has to be a point where you should be able to say, wake up. What you will see in the demonstration of the hypnosis, the 1 hour demonstration, at the end, the person actually tells that group which has been made to do all these crazy things. Because remember, these things can stay very deep inside. You've been made to behave like a duck. Well, you might just end up behaving like a duck tomorrow and the day after, not realizing it. So he makes a very clear statement. You observe carefully the wording he uses. He says, all the suggestions I have given to you are now completely erased and will have no impact at all. To that extent, he has to ensure the erasure of a suggestion made. That's how deep this thing works. Now, think of it also as a technology which could be used to awaken people or to, through a similar influence of the pouring of natural force, to redirect them to higher values. And that gives you a hint of how this faculty, this power of Vashita, can and should be used for assisting the acceleration of evolution itself. So I think I've given the more coarse forms examples. A lot of religious leaders and so-called spiritual leaders have this power. And it is often with this kind of a power that they exude a charisma that builds for large followings. I don't want to take names because there'll always be loyalties which people may have towards X or Y. Sometimes they may say things which are reasonable, good, inspiring, and even they may change your life because of something they do or say. And nevertheless, there'll be a certain quality which you will notice as hypnotic. If I may give one example, because not necessarily as a criticism, but it's still a power of fascination of this person called Osho. His earlier name was Rajneesh. He called himself Acharya Rajneesh initially, and later changed his name to Osho. And you will see when he speaks, there's a certain power of fascination. And he is literally able to draw your mind and take it in a particular way, skillfully. And there's a particular movement of the way he speaks and in his body language, which reminds you of, see, a movement like that. It's mesmerizing. And he uses that to great effect. So understand that these things do exist, and it's what makes for famous people often. I'm taking his name in particularly for one reason, because he has a very interesting criticism of Sri Aurobindo. He says that be very careful of reading Sri Aurobindo. He says that man can convince you of anything. So it was an acknowledgement of the clarity and rationality with which Sri Aurobindo presents his position. So what was the basis on which he rejected Sri Aurobindo's stance? Because finally it's presented so clearly and logically. So Osho says, or Rajneesh says, that Sri Aurobindo is wrong because he claims that when one person attains to supramental transformation, or whatever he understands by it, then the whole world will be transformed. So you have to wait for one person to achieve it, and then it will happen. And this is irrational, it's illogical, therefore Sri Aurobindo is wrong. And on that basis, it dismisses entirely Sri Aurobindo. What is interesting is that this claim which he attributes to Sri Aurobindo is completely false. Sri Aurobindo actually has statements to the contrary. He says it doesn't matter, even if one person got it, doesn't mean others would be transformed instantly. What's the point? So illogical. He dismisses that. And yet that is used against Sri Aurobindo to dismiss the entirety of everything he says. Interestingly, we found out how this happened. There was a My teacher, MP Pandit, had a lecture in 1992 in Pondicherry University where he actually gave this example. And there was a professor who stood up after the lecture and he said, I'm responsible for having taught this to Osho or Rajneesh at that time. And he said, I was convinced that Sri Aurobindo had made this statement, and I'm the one who told him this, and that's what he's repeating. Interesting. So it also meant that they never bothered to verify even. And anyway, so I'm digressing, but the point was that most people have this charismatic power, which is a hypnotic power, and it's a utilization of this power of Vashita. You see how in the text, as we have seen, Vashita itself is a natural consequence of Vyapti. And Vyapti, you can see, is a very basic empathic ability. From there, it's the pouring of the life force, which is generally the way by which one would grip. And generally, it's people with strong vitality who tend to have the Vashita faculty. So if this is the lower and ordinary Siddhi, what is the supreme or entirely divine Siddhi? That is when it acts automatically through established control of one nature by another. And this would be the natural way in which the spiritual consciousness would hold a space or a collective or even the earth in its consciousness and as if will it, shape it, direct it in a particular direction. And it would happen naturally without necessarily doing this kind of projection of a force or energy. In the identity itself, you feel, you lift, you shape, etc. So I think with this, we've covered the three powers. So I'll complete the topic itself today with the last paragraph of this topic where he says the conditions of power. It should be noted that none of the siddhis of power can act perfectly or freely so long as there is impurity of the chitta, egoism in the thought and temperament, or domination of desire in the use of the siddhi. Under such circumstances, there may be occasional use or irregular effectivity of the power, a thing not worth having in itself, but useful only in training the mind to give up its own sanskaras and habitual processes and accept the activity of the Vijnanamayi Shakti. Thus the supramental energy. Or there may be regular and effective use of limited powers by fixed tantric processes, kriyas. The latter should be shunned by the sadhakas of the Purna Yoga. So this is something we have already read before. The methods using techniques, kriyas of the Tantra for regular and effective use of limited power should be shunned. So those techniques we set aside. Many of these involve interactions with lower beings, etc. So they give regular and effective use, but the power is very limited because it's a lower being which is operating, not you doing it in any case. And it does not involve change of consciousness. So that is shunned. But when you have this mixture, and we'll study what the mixture is, during this mixture that you have, there may be occasional use and irregular effectivity of the power. So sometimes it just happens. Sometimes it happens, but partially in a mixed way. So this, he says, a thing not worth having in itself. What's the use of a power which occasionally functions and partially functions? But it is useful in training the mind to give up its own sanskaras and habitual processes. Now, sanskara is a certain mold of thought, mold of value system, which you have acquired. You're shaped in it. You've grown up in it. You don't even know that it's a mold that's limiting you. And then habitual processes of the mind. So in order to give up this, for training of giving up all this, it is useful to have this occasional and irregular working. So that you realize there is something greater and you can prepare your mind to let go of these sanskaras and habitual processes and accept the activity of the Vijnanamayi Shakti. Vijnana is supramental, Vijnanamayi of the supramental grade, Shakti, power, energy, consciousness, which is energy. So for the supramental conscious energy working in you, it is useful to recognize, oh, this thing works. Then I need to let go of my preconceptions and free my mind to be able to open to something higher. That's about the only use you can have for this occasional and irregular activity. So what is it that makes the occasional and irregular activity, and why? Which is also explained actually, though not obvious. So he describes the conditions which make for this occasional and irregular activity. So none of the siddhis of power can act perfectly or freely so long as, first, impurity of the chitta, egoism in the thought and temperament, and third, domination of desire in the use of the siddhi. Now, we have discussed this already before, but I will restate it in a different way now. What happens when you have a domination of desire in the use of the siddhi? You notice the siddhi itself is the natural working of the divine consciousness when it works in the world to exercise its power. And as you go up in the perfection of the siddhi, you're approaching that working of the divine consciousness. So the moment you put a strong desire as your motive or drive, you are reducing, disconnecting from the whole, cutting out a piece and pushing a piece. What's wrong with that? Nothing, it works. But it works in a narrow piece. It works in a narrow piece, and when there is some larger truth, it fails. So it works sometimes, it doesn't work sometimes. So in the way people often reflected it in using such powers, somebody, for example, has the ability of precognition. So he tries to perceive the lottery ticket numbers. And he notices that when it involves no personal benefit, it works. The moment he has a personal benefit, it doesn't work. Why? So the normal understanding is that, oh, because it's morally wrong. No, it's not morality. It's about what happens with the desire that comes with the personal benefit, which clouds your consciousness, which brings a mixture in the perception, etc. So he's still seeing something, or he goes blank, depending on the person, or he sees something and there's a blending, a mixture of something else because of the clouding of consciousness. If he was able to make it completely still and clear, then he could even see the number for his own lottery and make a benefit out of it. But having made that benefit, there would be other consequences. It would set in motion other energies, and he would have to face those consequences. So, yes, it can work in a narrow focus. But if at that time there's a larger influence which operates, it can completely overwhelm this, cloud this, block this, whatever. So, desire clouds your consciousness, prevents the free working of a deeper perception, but also reduces and limits any power action to a narrow piece. And when you have a narrow piece, consequences of these are also narrow. A narrow push will also face a pushback. A larger inclusive movement will have less of pushback because it takes a larger group into account. So there are other consequences. Impurity of the second thing was egoism in the thought and temperament. You're narrow. What is egoism? A narrowness. Remember, from the beginning, for Vyapti, we saw for the clarity of the perception, your consciousness had to become wide and feel in the empathy, in the identity, in the oneness. And the wider and freer it is, the more truly and clearly and completely it was able to perceive. What happens with egoism? Narrowing. And with the narrowing, the faculty itself sometimes works when the narrow piece is aligned to the narrow perception. It seems to work. A little misalignment and it does not perceive, or it wrongly perceives, etc. So egoism in the thought and temperament. You see, again, it's not a moral issue. It's a limitation of the state of consciousness. And then the first was impurity of the chitta. So impurity of the chitta, Sri Aurobindo defines impurity in the yogic terms as two kinds. One is the agitation which is natural to a grade of consciousness. And second is the mixture of a different grade onto this grade. So a higher grade or a lower grade blending in. So impurity of mind, for example, would be agitation in the mind your thoughts are restless, jumping around, or your emotions rising and clouding your thinking. There are two kinds of impurities. Correction for that, stilling the mind, making it completely calm and clear, separating the emotions from the mind. So all this is described in the synthesis of yoga. How do you purify? Still first and then separate. By separation, no more the emotions will cloud the mind. Right now, they're tightly woven in many people, not all. If you've trained your mind, become more rational, and a lot of modern education can help if correctly done, otherwise not. Your mind will be sufficiently separated that you can watch your own emotions and choose to separate further and complete that process. And then still the mind. So starting point is stilling, then separating. There's another definition you will find Sri Aurobindo Adimada has written when they say purity as against impurity. Purity is to respond only to the divine. You're looking at the same thing from a very different perspective, top down. But from bottom up and in terms of the effort in the sadhana, stilling and separating. Now, again, if you look back, remember this is part of the third limb of the integral yoga. The first two limbs started with equality, peace, remember? So if you've done that, and then the second limb was the working of the Shakti within you, which amplifies and widens the workings, etc. If you've gone through first and second, if you've gone through first, second becomes easier, natural. But if you've gone through first and second, then the third becomes easier, natural. You are already largely freed from the impurity of the chitta, largely freed from the egoism in the thought and temperament, and largely freed of domination of desire in the use of the siddhi. So already a basic clarity being there, if you've gone through the natural sequence, then the utilization of the power itself becomes not so limited or harmful. And so you will have more frequent use, more regular activity when you choose to develop it, if you choose to. You may or not also. But all this should be as a preparation to free yourself consciously from your own sanskaras, habitual thinkings, and belief systems, in order to open to something higher, which is the higher working of the supramental Shakti. So this is the conditions of power. I think I'm going to pause here. There are a few more paragraphs which deal with other things, which we will take up next time. I will look at the chat box. There are many questions also which we have pending, which we'll take up, but first the chat box. Yes, so Overmind is asking, off topic, can anyone tell me if this has been covered using cannabis edibles along with Ayurvedic herbs and fasting to open the body to the pranic and the higher mind levels? It has been covered many times before, but in this context, it will be worth repeating. What this does, so there are two questions. One is use of cannabis and other plants for opening to vital or mental levels. And the other is of fasting. So fasting, what it does is forcing the body to not get enough nutrition from its natural processes, triggers a separation from the physical and the vital. So part of the vital body begins then to separate from the physical. Suddenly you feel very light because you're more in the vital than in the physical. So the grossness and heaviness of the gross physical body is reduced. You say, oh, I'm feeling so good. I'm full of energy. My mind is so clear. It's come by the separation. But that state of separation is not a healthy state to stay for long, because eventually the body loses the support that it needs, and it only frees you from the gross inertia of that total identification momentarily. The moment you stop the fasting, you go right back and everything is there as before. Your consciousness did not change. So fasting for purpose of health is acceptable. Fasting for spiritual purposes is not at all useful. It only gives momentary excitation to the higher grades at a heavy cost to the physical body eventually. So spiritually, it has no value. As regards cannabis and other plants, herbs for psychedelics, particularly of various kinds, what they do is to open you to their equivalent grade of consciousness, which is generally in the ranges of the vital worlds. Not even to the mental. They are at best the mental within the vital. So there are certain herbs which open you to what seems like a very high refined state, and some will even say, oh, it's like a heavenly state, but it is still within the vital heavens. And what it does, because it acts at that grade, it opens you to the universality of that grade. So for people who do not have a deeper understanding of the spiritual and the nature of the occult and the higher worlds, that opening into wideness, they feel, oh, I feel one with the whole universe. This is a spiritual state, right? It's oneness that those people talk about. No, it's not. The fundamental is this, and this is what we have to understand. On every plane of consciousness, you can experience oneness and universality of that grade. That's not spiritual in itself. And this is what you're experiencing in that state if it has opened to oneness. Or more often than not, it may open you to something very dark and ugly and scary. But the problem is you've opened a gate which is physically based to a vital opening. And until that plant is washed out from your body, you're stuck with that open state. So perchance, if by opening you've opened to something ugly, or a vital being has now presented itself with your open door and gets in, you have absolutely no protection. First, you do not have the means to protect yourself. You don't know what it is you're doing, but you're totally open and there's no way even to pull you back. You have to wait for that whole process to die down or the stuff to be washed out from your bloodstream eventually by the biology process. So it lasts whatever few hours. During that time, you're totally exposed to that grade and anything can get into you at that point. Or if you have a vulnerability within you that could be triggered and create an imbalance, which even afterwards you will not be able to undo. So again, from a spiritual point of view, it has zero value because it does not take you to the higher ranges of the oneness of the spiritual consciousness. But more than that, it opens you to a level which is extremely dangerous. Now, the only utility I have heard, and I'm repeating this because it is a monk from the Ramakrishna mission who, when I criticized this use of these things, he said for him it was very useful. He said the first time that he had the psychedelics, and he was a normal American teenager, knowing nothing, believing nothing, but he was interested in the teachings of Ramakrishna Paramahansa. He had psychedelics. It broke his narrowness of the physical mind and gave him an experience that said, there is a greater reality. After that, he never did it again. So I will accept his statement that it is useful for somebody who's so totally stuck that it broke. But after that, he never did it again. On the other hand, from the spiritual guidance given within India, at least, they will say, do not even do that. Because in that one moment, you might open to something or destabilize something. And I will share with you my personal experience on this, which has happened in two ways, indirectly, unexpectedly. One, at some point, I was taking CBD oil for health reasons to see if it could help. It helped for a while, it did not, then I stopped. But at some point, I was given a sample and I had taken a drop. And then there was a lot stuck to the paper. So I said, why waste it? It's very expensive. So I licked the whole thing. And there was obviously, it was a strong dose. And for about a couple of hours, it was in a different state where I could feel the subtle physical very strongly. So comparing this to spiritual experiences, what I could recognize was it opened to a particular grade of the subtle physical, of a very distinct grade, momentarily. But that opening blocked me from access to the inner and higher ranges, interestingly. The other time when I had an equivalent experience was I'd gone to this darkness retreat where 10 days you were in total darkness. And it was also to see what it could do for rejuvenation of the body. as an experiment. But what happens at that point is after a while, the body builds up a huge amount of melatonin. And when you come out, of course, for a while, there is DMT in the blood. It out. But during the last few days, the DMT level is quite high. So you're almost constantly seeing like a light glow of light, as if moonlight. In total darkness, you're seeing that all the time. Of course, you don't see physical objects. What was interesting in my experience was that light being always present. You open your eyes or close, you're always seeing it. It prevented me from going deeper. Because I was used to going deep, let's say towards the ranges of the psychic influence, by the luminosity of that. And I would concentrate to recall and connect with that and use that as the point to go deep. In attempting to go deep, I would find this light like a screen in between, which is the DMT level light. And it was distracting. I had to make an extra effort to as if go beyond it, to bypass it, to go to the normal space of the inner immersion. None of these had any shift in consciousness of an inner or higher range of any kind. Nothing corresponding or even assisting an opening to higher grade of the mind's faculty or the intuitive faculty or the psychic. So very distinctly, I can say that they serve no spiritual basis. They serve no spiritual benefits. And the better thing would be to avoid them and rather find the direct way of connecting to the inner ranges. Okay, same over mind is asking, has anyone experienced Kapalabhati pranayam and its effects once done for a couple of hours every day? I know, okay, there's one more comment by same person. Kapalabhati seems to be the cure-all if someone can put their concentration and faith and aspiration into it, and seems to open the body to higher forces, pranic and mental. So I'll comment on this. There is a particular teacher here in India who is very famous for using this kind of pranayam and rapid breathing as part of what he calls initiation ceremony, in which he gets people to do that rapidly, intensely for many minutes and then suddenly stop. And at that point, the entire hall breaks up, some people laughing, some people crying, some people falling unconscious, etc. And he calls. Unfortunately, it is a very dangerous practice and it has absolutely no spiritual value. They don't recommend doing it because suddenly your brain goes into a strong state of oxygen deprivation or excess of oxygen, which unbalances the acidity and the pH of the blood. It's a destabilizing state. So you should never stop, certainly. You're supposed to, even in the tradition, gradually peter out. But as such, again, spiritually, it has zero value. It has value at best of amplifying life force. But if you amplify too much too rapidly without a solid basis in consciousness or in the habit of the body, you will again unbalance your consciousness. I'm not using Kapalabhati, but by other means, I had once concentrated intensely life energy into the body to try to amplify and see how far I could take it. One of the things it did was destabilize the sleep and trigger anger states because I could not contain the excess energy. And then I just let it subside to whatever was normal. But something like that happens to these people, and often they end up with high blood pressure and other physical problems when they overdo these things. So best is not to overdo any of these exercises and be clear of why you're doing it. Are you doing it to strengthen the biology, amplify life force? Do it in a graded way, slowly. Let the system habituate. But know that it has zero spiritual value by itself. It will not bring you closer to the psychic. It will not open you to the higher spiritual, the higher intuitive, nothing. It does not change your nature. It only amplifies your nature. So the last comment, which is very interesting, person says, it seems to be a cure-all if someone can put their concentration and faith and aspiration into it. Yes, but if you can do that, anything can be a cure-all. You can take up any activity with full faith, aspiration, concentration, and you will get the result that you desire. Sri Aurobindo makes a comment in joke, in jest, in one of the evening talks. He says, even a knock of a hammer can be turned into a therapy if you do it with that faith. So recognize there is the faith, concentration, and aspiration which gives you the result, not the thing that you're doing. So avoid the dangerous thing. And with the same pure focus, psychological focus of the faith, aspiration, and concentration on the divine presence, you will get the same result with less danger and less distraction, less indirect focus. So go back to the discussion we have had in one of these earlier talks, which is titled The Direct Method, where this whole issue is discussed in some detail. And avoid anything which is fundamentally destabilizing or dangerous. So Shanta asks, are Vyapti and widening of consciousness connected? I'll put it this way. Vyapti will be more effective if your consciousness is wider. If your consciousness is narrow, you will feel the impact of somebody else's state or consciousness touching, entering. But if it is wider, it's already within you. And to that extent, your sensitivity, also perception are clearer, more deep. So I would say the clarity of the Vyapti will grow with the natural widening of consciousness, and the deepening of consciousness will give you Vyapti on a deeper level. So here comes a very important feature of both the knowledge Siddhis as well as the power Siddhis. We have not discussed this angle so far, but this is extremely important. Everywhere you saw, even in the power Siddhi, the Vyapti became the basis for the influence put out. But on what level do you experience Vyapti? The level of consciousness that is conscious in you. Our starting point is a more superficial consciousness, a more emotional, sentimental consciousness where you feel this empathic. But there's an equivalent which is mental, empathic. You don't call it empathy, perhaps does not matter. Sometimes they use the word telepathy, teleempathy. So it's a mental identity where you feel the thought of the other, not so much the sentimental, emotional state. There's also an equivalent of the physical, where you feel in the physical body the experience of the other. So from childhood, I was hypersensitive to these things. And so I had to protect myself. And sometimes it would happen, I'm on a phone call with somebody, and the person says, you know what, I just, I had fallen and I hurt myself and my leg is paining intensely. And as I'm listening, some part of me tended to identify, and then I would say, is it the left leg? And the person says, yes, because I'm feeling the pain at that point. Almost physical level. Of course, it's energy, but on the physical. So I didn't know what to do at that point. So I was learning to somehow block it and prevent it. In time, of course, that became, it was no more a problem. But at that time, it used to be an issue. So there's that grade of identity. But all this is still superficial. When you go within, in the inner, you shift to a level which is subtle physical. You shift to the level which is inner vital. You shift to a level which is inner mental. You shift to a higher grade, inner grade further. According to the level where you're conscious, you will also develop the Vyapti, the underlying sense of perception of that level. This is where life gets more interesting, spiritually, I mean. So if you have an emotional empathy, you feel the other person's emotion. But when you have a deeper awareness within you, you feel that deeper layer in the other. And then you can sense tendencies there, which are of much greater value and of spiritual value. And also you can intervene on that level because the contact is on that level and nudge for a spiritual outcome or on a higher, inner, etc. So the more your consciousness deepens and widens, the more meaningful in depth and wideness is the perception of the Vyapti or the exercise of the Prakamya or even subsequently the Siddhis of power. Since the power Siddhis are finally basing themselves on a contact of consciousness, this will still be the basis. So that's why the Siddhis of knowledge become the base for the Siddhis of power. You don't go straight to the power. You go with knowledge, awareness, identity, and then modify in the identity. But deepen your consciousness and widen it, heighten it, and in those ranges you will feel, perceive, etc. That is far more interesting, isn't it? Shanta makes the correction. Dr. Venkatasamy, sorry. He is the founder of the Aravind Eye Hospital. And it's around him that the study was done and with this ability he had. So Rumpel says, imagine there is Asuric Vashita. Yes, absolutely. So Vashita being a faculty, let's say, it's being used for good and bad by anybody. This is what Hitler used to do also in his ability to inspire and affect people. If you look at the videos of the programs that he had, when he would speak, you would have all these people standing in attention in the thousands, soaking in whatever he was transmitting into them. And some of it had idealism, but a perverted idealism because it became egoistic idealism of a national ego and a narrowing rather than a freeing to a wider diviner or universal consciousness. So unfortunately, so if you look at the things he did, you must understand why it is that his people followed him blindly. Why was he so successful? And it was not merely a hypnotic ability, it also played on higher aspirations and values of people. It offered them great solutions. Except that there was a twist. And that one twist turned what could potentially have been even a positive awakening for a people into a destructive perversion. And so when you can see the power that he has on the people, they soak up and they go crazy when he speaks. And yes, it is an asuric influence utilizing that power. What's the difference? Is the direction you set to the influence put out. Krishna Veti says, yes, there are in certain cults, this is what you see. Cults often are built around people who have this kind of a power of Vashita, typically. And the low-grade power of Vashita, hypnotic ability, and they kind of seize upon vulnerable types and make them more vulnerable. If you understand the way cults are designed to hook you, they bring you in with a lot of affection and warmth, hook you with sense of belonging, sense of being cared for, which you might not have got elsewhere. So they look for these vulnerable people who are yearning for that family sense and protection and safety. You're brought in, and then you are asked to conform to the cult processes and values. And there's often a very magnetic, charismatic figure in the center who holds it all together. And as far as the magnetic, charismatic person goes, it does not matter what he teaches. And sometimes he teaches things which are so outrageously foolish, stupid and perverse sometimes, that you would question, what is this? And still you're under the grip. And you're stopped from thinking or questioning. This is an example I'm going to share, and I'll take a name here. Mark Oban actually shares, he exposes, so I'm not taking credit for the exposure, so I'm hiding behind him. He exposes this person who is called Rael. There's a documentary on him you'll find on Netflix, which he started this ambassadors for extraterrestrials. And Mark Oban exposes that one of his friends was involved who gave him the suggestion. He wanted to start a cult. Mark Oban's friend actually told him, why don't you try this? And he said, yeah, that's a great idea. Otherwise, he wanted to do something else. And the first thing he did was, in his cult, they had to take a mirror, get naked, and observe their private parts of the mirror. That was the first practice. I mean, it is so ridiculously stupid. But the charismatic power, and probably there's an entity behind which uses that, hooks into people and keeps them. Inevitably, that power fails at some point, and there are breakdowns, there are breakups, all kinds of things, but they keep finding new victims and build on it. EJH says it's terrifying to think I'm going to repeat more often the Mahamrityunjay mantra in case someone claims to know previous births or hypnotic regression. Is it true or just a suggestion? And Zen Rain says, what about affirmations or mantras as forms of self-hypnosis? Okay, so first thing, you should never be afraid. Rather, become conscious. If you're conscious within you of what is happening, you will feel it. Like the person who put his hand on my knee to pump energy, or when I felt his aura surrounding, gripping. If you're conscious, you will feel these influences. You'll recognize what grade they represent or what they're trying to do. And even if at that moment you cannot resist it, once you go away, you will look back, yeah, I noticed that. I will not trust it. That's all. Very simple. Do not fear first. If ever you have a doubt, simply invoke, visualize, feel more than visualize. Invoke the protection of the Divine Mother, the Divine Presence around you. Feel the presence within you, around you. Hold it like a bubble of protection, and then enter that space holding this protection. You'll find automatically that influence will not penetrate easily. Or if it starts penetrating, you will feel. And what is more interesting, and it's because it's happened with me, the person who's exuding that influence will immediately identify you as somebody who is not amenable to that, and either point you out or stare at you strangely and then ignore you or whatever it is. It's interesting. So trust that what you have in conscious awareness and opening to the divine presence is far more powerful than this low-grade games. At least in giving you awareness and warning. After that, it's your choice. You may choose to submit, and then it's a different story. About using hypnosis for regression or affirmations of mantras for self-hypnosis, yes, those are good. What are you doing at that point? Understand what is hypnosis. It's will applied from one nature to another, generally from somebody else's nature on your nature. You can put from your higher nature to your lower nature. That's called self-hypnosis then. So what you're doing is you're putting an intention in the part of the mind, let's say, turning to the part of the emotions or something lower where you're not so conscious, and says, I want to be free of this, or I want to reshape this behavior. Through repetition, through visualization, through infusion, with faith, etc., you're influencing. It's the same mechanism, but from your higher part to your other parts. And yes, those can be used if you find it helpful. I don't see a problem there. Affirmations, mantras, repetitions particularly are useful for the lower grade of the more physical consciousness, which needs rhythm and repetition to catch something. But the same thing would be far more effective if done in a state of movement and activity, and if brought into the very movement in which you want to make that change. So observe how it works, experiment, explore, see what works, and fine-tune. But do not fear, understand rather. It is this knowledge which will free you from misuse. Yes, so there's a documentary on Osho called Wild Wild Country, and I've not seen it yet, but many people have seen it, found that helpful to understand some of these things. I'm a little wary of these documentaries because they often have an agenda, sometimes even to obfuscate or misdirect. But broadly, many elements which are purely historical would be useful to understand. Okay, so there's a question from Rajarshi, related to desire interfering with Siddhis. Is the solution to remove desire or to open to the Divine Mother while still having some desire? If I had to quote, not accurately, from the mother, she says about removing desire, she says, just try in a sarcastic way. You can't. Desire is the very nature of that particular grade of consciousness. What you can purify in the desire is to first bring stillness and then turn it to yield to its own deeper truths, which takes a different form then. But there'll still be in that grade of consciousness of life energy a certain capacity to reach out, to accomplish, to do. If you try to kill the desire, its power to actualize is also being killed. So purification and liberation are a superior way than suppression or killing of any of these faculties, including desire. And again, desire has two forms. There is a petty, narrow desire, and there's a larger, greater, selfless desire. Observe the differences. When your desires are small, narrow, self-centered, and desires, I desire to serve the divine is itself a desire, isn't it? I desire to create something great for helping others, perhaps, or even for my own fame, but something great which will be useful to humanity, even if it gives you fame, no problem. Please use that as a motivation. You may need it at a certain stage in your life. So notice the difference between narrow, selfish desires versus widening, freeing, liberating, or even higher movements of desires. And it doesn't become a pure aspiration just because you say, my desire is to become a perfect instrument to the divine. It's still a vital desire. And it's good. Start with that. Start with what you have turned towards a greater, wider, freer goal, tending towards the divine as much as possible. Even if it is in your job, I want to attain this, give to it a higher turn in order to serve the divine, in order to develop my capacity, in order to make something beautiful that will help others, whatever form it takes. So that would be a superior way to turn the desire meaningfully. Open to the Divine Mother while still having some desire, yes, that would be one way to do. I would say include the desire in the opening itself. Not have this and then that as separate things. Include the desire in the opening. Include everything as much as you can, including what you consider wrong. By opening is how you will purify and free it from its distorted tendencies. Understand, in the integral yoga, every grade of consciousness has a very special use. Its current movement is warped, limited, or distorted. And the movement and the form of the movement has to be freed and liberated and purified. But the grade itself has a natural innate truth and function in the larger divine working in you and in the transformation of your consciousness. So one of these gradations, the life energy within you, for example, Sri Aurobindo says, its purpose is to enjoy life. You suppress the life energy, you lose enjoyment of life. But that enjoyment, instead of being narrow, personal, superficial, would deepen, widen, and it becomes a vehicle for the joy of life, which is intended in the divine transformed state. But the grade of joy and the form it takes is very different. But it's the same grade of consciousness. So it's useful for you to read Sri Aurobindo in the Synthesis of Yoga, where he describes all these gradations when he talks of purification of each of these, and what is their actual function and how you actually work to free it. But general principle would be include everything that you can in the opening to the divine. Do not allow particularly these wrong ideas that, oh, this is a bad, I'm having desire has to go. That comes from the ascetic tradition, where desire has to be killed. Here, desire has to be opened and purified, let's say, and eventually transformed. But opened and purified and turned Godward would be a better way. But understand, even if you can't do that perfectly, the intent beginning already changes the game. Start the process. Do not aim for perfection. Aim rather at steady growth in the right direction. So again, coming specifically and to Rajeshri's question, if you intend to work on some of these faculties, powers of knowledge or of power, yes, it's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Do it more as a way of cultivating your consciousness and its capacities. Exercise it initially in spaces of work where you anyway have to achieve. If in your job, you're in a negotiation, you have to anyway overwhelm the others to your advantage. You're anyway going to do that with or without this power. So you exercise the power in that activity which anyway you're directing your energies to as part of your work. See how it works. Play with it and observe carefully, and that's how you will learn and develop that skill. Not all of us may feel the need to do this. There are other things more important. Well, it's a choice you make. But for those who feel drawn to exploring, I would say go ahead, but use it in this way. Even initially, you may experiment. You see Sri Aurobindo doing this. A boy is walking on the road. He puts an influence for a particular outcome. None of these are harmful, but they are testing your capacity, directing it to a bird, working with a plant, whatever form it may take. Do it in spaces where you find it interesting. That makes it easier to develop the faculty. The moment it becomes boring as an exercise, it doesn't work. So these are experiences people have had, especially from the training when they try to develop these faculties in the military. Interesting always made it easier and allowed the joy of the faculty's development to open up, making it easier for them to work. Interesting. Vinod says in the Gospel of Ramakrishna, fasting is prohibited. But again, you understand why. And there are health benefits to fasting. And for that, you might want to do it. So, Aurorashmi is saying, if an individual is in trouble and needs something for personal use, practicing Sri Aurobindo's yoga, can you apply these siddhis for personal use or better to use only for mass benefit? I would say, why not? Very simply put, you're anyway exercising this when trying to gain something. You need money, you're going to go to a bank or whatever to borrow money. And there's that clerk who's refusing or whatever it is. You're going to convince him. It's happening anyway. Now, instead of going purely by logical argument, you're trying to make a shift in your consciousness and extending a different influence to see if you can assist that to get the outcome you want. Why not? So, as such, it's not wrong because anyway it's happening. It's wrong when the utilization of it would be harmful to somebody or to some outcome. If it is merely for personal gain, in principle, that's fine. But remember the 4 requirements Sri Aurobindo has warned us about. Review that discussion which we had 2 sessions ago. And particularly there, if you can remember this, that you have to see these as powers which have a natural unfoldment within you. And do not confuse this with spirituality. It's still a faculty power of nature, maybe a higher nature. Do not lose sight of your primary objective, which is your spiritual development. And then you're fine. Play with it. After a while, you say, it works, it's fine. I used it for a particular outcome. Now it's no more useful. There'll be others who will say, as part of a certain development, this is happening, I'm going to perfect it. Make it pure. Make those gradations of consciousness completely transparent to a higher working. Then you're exploring the power for the purpose of measuring the perfection of your consciousness. So there'll be many reasons. See what works. Do not lose sight of the primary goal. Madhuri is asking, how do great gurus who are not in the body connect to seekers in given time? Is it mental creation or actually there's a connection? Has Sri Aurobindo and the mother set any such time? So there was also an email regarding, I think it's from Madhuri also. So she gives an example there of somebody who prayed to a particular person who was a saint or for them a guru, and then that benefit came. So I would simply put a lot of people, a lot of famous gurus were not spiritual to begin with, and as was the case in the example, the name she had mentioned, which I don't name. But the fact that the disciples prayed with genuine aspiration would draw a response from the divine in any case, because they used that person's image as an entry point to the divine or representing the divine. The person need not have been. But since they had a faith and it was turned to the divine, finally, they also got a response. It also happens that sometimes it did not come as a help at all, but since the thing happened, they took it as coming from that particular guru. So I have given an example of how people explain away easily. But when actually there's a response, it is also coming because you had turned it finally to God through that particular image. Then simply put it directly as much as possible to what represents for you the divine. But aim not at the form through which you relate to the divine, but to the divine through the form. Then the result will be more complete. So finally, if it's the divine who's helping, it does not matter whether that person is in the physical body or not. There is a difference also when we speak of Sri Aurobindo and the mother, because not only were they transparent to the divine consciousness that they incarnated, but also that they have chosen to take a stance which is in the subtle physical. It's a matter of statement that the mother made. So if you are conscious of that, or if you had the experience of that, you will say, yes, it's true. In any case, remember, even when you address it to Sri Aurobindo and the mother, do not stop short with this physical form. The physical form is an embodiment of a consciousness which is the Divine Mother, open to the Divine Mother through the form. The form allows you to make a personal relation, but always aim for the fullness of who is behind, who inhabits that form. Vaijayanti is asking, did Osho use drugs to give experience to disciples? I don't know if he did, but there was a lot of drug use in his community. But he had practices, he has practices even now in some of his communities, which are destabilizing on an emotional level. They have, for example, in one of the centers, they used to have 1 hour of laughing, 1 hour of crying, and then 1 hour of free sex. Now, all three you will see are destabilizing energetically. Exaggerated, pushed to the limit, exhausting the system, exhausting the nervous system particularly, the result of which would be some unbalanced state. An unbalanced state is easy to recognize as a non-normal, abnormal, or if they have been told it is spiritual, to believe that it's spiritual, similar to when you take psychedelic drugs. But it's an unbalanced state of the nervous system, has no spiritual value. So to me, the fact that such practices were encouraged would straight away take him or the teaching itself out of the spiritual domain. So the last, if is hypnosis and sankalpa same? Madhuri is asking. So there's a common feature. So sankalpa is a determination, full focus of the will towards a particular outcome. Is hypnosis the same as that? No. In hypnosis, there is access to subliminal layers. There is a going behind the surface appearance. Sankalpa may be purely directed outward. They're totally different phenomena. They can have an overlap. You can make a sankalpa from a interiorized or a hypnotized state of some kind, etc. But they're different things, not to confuse them. Trinetra is saying rampant constant daydreaming and ruminating prevents me from paying attention, being present and meditating. How to stop this? Observe what you're doing in the meditation. If you're simply sitting with eyes closed, your mind will wander. Your mind has to be placed on something which is for you meaningful. An experience, a state, something which touches what is real or more real. Then you'll find your mind won't wander. If you hold an experience, feel your love for the Divine Mother, for example, as a starting point from the Bhakti Center. Feel the love, draw yourself into the love, feel the immersion in that closeness. Stay in it as long as you can hold your attention. If you find your mind wandering, if the wandering is outside superficial, ignore it, hold the experience. When you find the experience itself cannot be held longer, quietly end the concentration, opening the eyes, extending that state into your eyes open, waking state, surface state, and then extend it into work. Even if you have done this for half a minute or 1 minute of immersion, then extending it will be more valuable than staying with the eyes closed and wandering around. So observe what you're doing, make the correction there. Cling to something real and extend and link it to the surface state of activity. That's how the thing will grow. And then with that, your capacity to deepen also will gradually grow. Mahesh says, for someone trying to open to the mother, shouldn't the siddhis be concomitant of inner growth rather than pursuits? It seems they may distract from opening to the mother if they are chased after. Yes, we've already discussed that. But understand that for some people, it's not chased after. It's a faculty which is already there. You're feeling it. You have certain experiences and you want to develop and perfect them. For those, it is legitimate to pursue that as long as you keep the primary focus still ongoing. For others, even in the sadhana itself, as the sadhana proceeds, these things may happen occasionally, but you may not even find them interesting. It's a question of temperament. Or you may observe them with interest, but feel no need to develop them. And that's a choice you may make. For others, it may be through play of these experiences that they may also get the joy of in the pursuit of the sadhana as variations of the central process. So as long as you're clear about this, I don't see a problem. And it's not that you're chasing after it. It's that you're consciously cultivating and refining certain experiences. So Vaijayanti is asking, do we need asceticism at least up to a certain extent in today's world, which is full of materialism and denies spirituality altogether? I would say no, it would be a mistake. Asceticism is the denial of matter towards an otherness. And that would be another mistake. It's as wrong as the complete materialism which denies the spirit. What you need is a disengagement from exclusive focus in materialism to open to your own inner and higher possibilities and experiences and bridge it with the material life so that those higher values and experiences can improve, change, and increase the growth in your surface material life. It's the bridging of these which is needed, not swinging to another extreme in contradiction to this. And this is what Sri Aurobindo teaches. And as far as we are aware, he's still the only source of teaching in the world today which teaches this unification of spirit and matter in transformation of life. There are others who do a unification as a compromise, a little bit of this, a little bit of that to balance it out. That's not it. Transform matter in terms of the spirit. The only teaching you have today is Sri Aurobindo. And that's why this is so important. So I think that's enough for today. We have covered the Siddhis of power, the 3 Siddhis of power, and the conditions of the power, Siddhis of power. And the next is conditions of jnana for the knowledge, physical Siddhis, samadhi. And from here, we will then go to the underlying basis on which these Siddhis also can be perfected, which are actually the first 2 steps of this third limb. So if you look at the limb of the yoga, the third limb of the yoga, Sri Aurobindo, it's the Vijnana Chatushtaya. The first is divine knowledge, jnanam. Second is Trikala Drishti, conscious awareness of past, present, and future. And then comes the 8 Siddhis. And then samadhi. So these are the 4 facets of this third limb of yoga. So what is this divine knowledge? And what is the Trikala Drishti? And how do they relate to the Siddhis? And then the samadhi? We'll explore that a little bit the next time, and then we will see the texts in the record of yoga which give examples of some of these things. So I think it will be interesting for us. Let's take a moment to center ourselves in our aspiration. All of these faculties are really inevitable in the normal evolution of humanity. From a more evolved being's perspective, and sometimes there are civilizations on other planets which are far more evolved, they look at humanity today and they say, oh, these are immature children still. They don't even know their own inner and higher ranges of consciousness, how lost they are. And we will ourselves look back at our current state, maybe in some not so distant future, maybe in this very lifetime, and say, oh, I started with that, and I had no idea that there's so much within, which is me, and a part of me, and all the faculties which correspond to those states, just waiting for us, like flower blooming and petals which still have to open. It is inevitable. And in the nature of the integral yoga also, it is a necessary fulfillment of the opening of our consciousness. So let's stay in a conscious aspiration for this to open more and more under the influence and guidance of the divine Shakti, the divine mother working in us more and more. Namaste.